Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Standards Committee meeting. Can I ask you all, if you have mobiles, to switch them off or put them on silent? I'll do the same myself, just in case I get told off. Apologies from anybody?
Chair, I've got apologies from Councillor A.W. Graves, from Peter Purnell and Stuart Green.
Okay, thank you. Late items to be introduced by the Chair. There are none. Declarations of interest, anybody? No? Okay. Moving on to minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of November 2021. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Item 5, which is to look at the Standards Committee forward plan. And to tell us about that will be Alex. If members have questions regarding anything, then we'll let Alex finish and then ask them.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully this report is fairly self-explanatory, but it comes off the back of the work that this committee has done in the past on reviewing the Local Government Association's Model Code of Conduct and the resulting changes that were approved to the Councillors' Code of Conduct at Council in September of last year. Clearly this committee had an influence over those recommendations, and similarly prior to that the recommendations on the Committee on Standards in Public Life. And in discussion with Emily as the monitoring officer and Stephen, who deals with standards matters in democratic services, we felt that we needed to give the committee an opportunity to discuss some issues arising from those recommendations and similar recommendations and national discourse around standards in public life that crop up from time to time. And we thought the best way to do that was to replicate the structure that we use for some of our other committees by giving this committee a forward plan to identify items where we feel the committee could add value to the general piece around upholding high standards of governance in the council. And so we have put together this draft forward plan which highlights a few areas where we feel this committee could add value. We're conscious that this committee spends a lot of its time looking at the outcomes of complaints and the progress of complaints, and we wanted to look at some other areas of this committee's terms of reference as they're defined in the Council Constitution to broaden its work slightly. And this report is obviously there to allow items to be raised for discussion at future meetings. We will obviously bring reports back to aid the discussion of those items, but it allows this committee to influence and shape best practice amongst our councillors on a range of different issues. So as I mentioned, the terms of reference for this committee talks about monitoring the effectiveness of related codes and protocols, i.e. codes and protocols related to the Councillors' Code of Conduct. So there are various documents that sit within our constitution that we think require regular review, potentially by this committee. So things like the Councillor Officer Protocol, which is an important point of reference for ourselves as officers, certainly when we're dealing with complaints informally, and also for councillors. And this committee also has a responsibility to advise on training for councillors on matters relating to the Councillors' Code of Conduct. And through our professional networks in democratic services and related disciplines, we're aware of discussions that take place at a national level in terms of things like digital citizenship and the role that technology is playing in the role of councillors. And when we look at that locally, we see things like social media use having cropping up in more and more complaints that are raised through the councillor complaints process. And so we think there is some value to be gained by this committee looking at how councillors go about using social media and some guidelines and some training on best practice that could be recommended to our cohort of 51 councillors. As I say, it follows up on some quite useful resources that are available at a national level through the Local Government Association's Digital Citizenship project. But Hopefully the report, as I say, is fairly self-explanatory. It can be amended, added to by this committee. We will bring back reports to future meetings, and hopefully we'll have a rolling forward plan that we can look at each meeting, and then we can come back with more detailed reports about the areas that are identified for review as they relate to the terms of reference of the Standards Committee. Happy to take any questions, but fundamentally we feel that by having a forward plan and looking at some of these issues, it will result in fewer complaints ultimately, which means less expense through external investigation and quicker resolution of the fewer complaints that we'll be dealing with as a result, and ultimately contribute to upholding higher standards, and the result of that is greater public confidence in the authority at large, I suppose. But as I say, Chair, happy to take any questions from yourself or the committee.
Thank you, Alex. Members of the committee? Yes.
Just a couple of things. Really a matter of emphasis, I think, probably. I think in 4.2 somewhere, it talks about training, and I think, obviously, training is key to the whole thing, and it's a question of not just what training, but how often training, who to training, particularly with, obviously, moving to all-in-all-out elections. Obviously, it's not going to happen now. You're not going to be new members every 3 years out of 4, just one year out of 4. So quite clear that's a key point. 4.4 talks about disclosable pecuniary interests. Declarations of interest is an issue that's also come up at the audit committee, the last audit committee, I think it was. Of our only 2 issues there, it's just seemed to be a key point that I think there needs to be an investigation into that area anyway, but that's a matter for the audit committee, I think, rather than that. I think that's quite important. The key one, though, I think, is the social media thing, the best practice guidance and things, because quite clearly we got a significant number of issues coming to us as complaints about things that have happened on social media. I'm not a user of social media myself, but obviously best practice is presumably out there somewhere or other, and we perhaps need to be adopting that and looking to find out what best practice there is available. I'm sure there must be some somewhere. Just one other point, which isn't really a point for this committee. Just on Appendix 1, you talk. It always has the dates TBC. Is there any chance that the council might establish the dates for its meeting more than 1 year ahead, or is that perhaps a little bit too radical? Just sorry.
Chair, I can respond to each of those points if that's okay. Just on that point around dates, clearly the council sets its schedule of meetings at its annual meeting in May each year. However, we do have a draft schedule of meetings in circulation prior to that point, and it would be sensible for us to circulate that to our independent members to make sure that they can be available. That process starts around this time of year, in fact. It is difficult to set the schedule any further in advance than that, but generally speaking, the schedule doesn't change too much from year to year, so maybe a bit of movement, 1 or 2 dates, but broadly speaking, it's the same schedule each year. In terms of those 3 points, I think most of those are captured on the forward plan, I'd like to say. Around councillor training, we can bring back a report that talks about what are the mandatory training requirements for councillors at this moment in time, what are the things which are discretionary, and clearly it's within this committee's gift to make recommendations on areas where, if there are areas that you think should be mandatory or should be strengthened, then a resolution from the Standards Committee would carry considerable weight when we're planning our training programme for future years. So I think that's an obvious candidate for something to be added to the forward plan and discussed at a future meeting. We could slot that in wherever the committee sees fit. The declarations of pecuniary interest are on the forward plan already, I believe. There were some changes introduced to the Councillors' Code of Conduct as they relate to DPIs in September. We are undertaking a piece of work at this moment in time to update our DPI forms to reflect the new changes, and also issue some guidance on declarations of gifts and hospitality, the requirements for that having changed as well. So again, we can pick that up at the March meeting if you're happy for it to be included in the forward plan. And similarly, Emily is a member of a Derbyshire-wide group of monitoring officers, and there is a protocol being produced amongst that group for how potential DPI offences are reported to monitoring officers, and subsequently, if necessary, reported through to the police, because as you'll be aware, failure to declare a DPI in some circumstances is a criminal offence. And then finally, on social media, I completely agree. I think we've seen more and more instances of social media playing a role in the complaints that we deal with. There are plenty of resources that we could take the opportunity to review from nationally recognised organisations such as the Local Government Association, for example. And some councils have chosen to adopt on the back of that guidance a social media protocol for its members to highlight what is considered best practice and what is safe practice as well, because there is a growing discourse around councillor safety on the back of the instance that we've seen recently, most obviously the tragic circumstances in Southend. So I think best practice around social media relates to councillor safety in some respects and how councillors can engage with their electorate effectively, but in a way that protects them and doesn't put anyone at any unnecessary risk. So I think there are lots of related issues around that could lead to a valuable discussion, and hopefully this committee is best placed to take that forward.
Anybody else? I have just a few concerns about this, and one of them is on 3.2. If you look down to D, it says, do anything which compromises or is likely to compromise the impartiality of those who work for, on behalf of your authority.
Excuse me, Chair, could you just clarify where 3.2 of what document?
Yeah, it's scope, just on the page after scope, part 1, general provisions, and you carry on to the page. We should really...
The Code of Conduct?
Yes, we should... yeah. Sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. Yeah. Yeah, the other one I wanted to talk about was 4.4, the second thing about existing protocols relating to councillor conduct, effective working relationship with officers, and access to facilities and resources, which were last reviewed in autumn 2019. I just wanted to ask, I mean, I've been a councillor since 2004, and where it says relationship with officers, it shouldn't be a one-way traffic where we have to have relationships with officers. Officers should have relationships with us as well. So that should be clarified as to that the relation should be both ways, because if an officer is not working with or relating to an inquiry, then the elected member has a right to ask why not. And if that officer feels aggrieved to it and wants to do something, that's fine. But it should be both ways. We shouldn't have to work with officers as elected members all the time. Officers must work with us. So I'd like that altered, that it should be a two-way relationship and not just how we conduct ourselves. It's how they conduct ourselves with us, which ultimately leads to how we conduct with them.
Thanks, Chair. Just to clarify, that protocol on councillor-officer relations already exists, and it is very much written in the expectations of accountabilities that councillors can expect from officers and officers can expect from councillors. It is written in that way already. Clearly, we feel that it is appropriate for that protocol to be regularly reviewed and to make sure that it continues to reflect what we consider to be best practice. But the existing document, I would suggest, already makes that distinction, that it's a two-way street, that councillors and officers should conduct their business with mutual respect and a mutual understanding of our different roles and accountabilities. So I can absolutely reassure you on that point, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. It's just that, most of the time when documents come before us here, obviously we don't probably have the full set, but it's always a case of the councillor or elected member having to do things and not sort of in a reciprocal fashion by the officer concerned. Would anybody else like to add anything to that? No?
It would be fall within the purview of the employee code of conduct, which I think is probably a matter for the personnel committee rather than this committee, I suspect.
Officers do declare interest.
Okay. Can we, before we go on to volume and outcome of councillors, are we allowed to just to talk about the code of conduct?
The code of conduct isn't intended to be covered by this report, Chair. So maybe it would be better if you've got a query about that, for us to discuss it outside this meeting and bring it to a further meeting, or I can clarify it for you outside the meeting. Would that be appropriate?
Well, okay, we'll put it on for the next agenda then, because it's not something that I want to discuss in private. I believe it should be for the members of the Standards Committee and not just for my benefit.
Okay, well, we can add that to the forward plan. That's the point of this
Okay,
report.
yeah. Yeah, if you sort of make a note of that, then Alex, that from time to time we'd like to review the code of conduct and maybe if there are outstanding issues or concerns by elected members, that we should be able to deliberate on it. Thank you. Okay, then in that case we'll move on to volume and outcomes of council complaints. 21, 22.
Thank you, Chair. The report at item 6 is a standard report which gives the committee an update on the volume and outcome of councillor complaints dealt with in the current municipal year. The report, there is also an exempt part to this report which we will discuss later in the meeting, but this report simply sets out the number of complaints that have been received and how those have been dealt with over the course of the past municipal year. The information about those complaints is set out in the supporting information section at paragraphs 4, and the recommendation that I would bring to committee is that to note the volume and outcome of council complaints as outlined in the report. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Will do, Chair, thank you. So I'll give you a shout when it's finished broadcasting.